The podcasting technology of NORML is made possible by Red Aphid Interactive Media. More information at redaphid.com. And distributed by the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws in Washington, D.C. This is your daily audio stash, the growing truth about cannabis. Welcome to the most popular audio podcast regarding marijuana in all of America and all the world, featuring interviews with scientists, politicians, doctors, prohibition policy activists, regular cannabis consumers, musicians, and NORML staff and NORML's board of directors, along with music and comedy no other podcast can offer. You can always find out more about the show at our website, NORMLAudiostash.com. We're ending marijuana prohibition with education, one listener at a time. Welcome back to NORML's Daily Audio Stash. Today, it is Wednesday, August 1st. I'm your host, Chris Goldstein. Take a moment to join us at NORML to help end senseless marijuana prohibition in America. It's been going on for over 70 years here in the U.S. Make sure you help end it right now, today, by making a donation or joining NORML today at NORML.org. Later on this week on the Audio Stash, we're going to speak with former Dallas Cowboy and now NORML Advisory Board member Mark Stepnoski. He'll be emceeing the Austin Freedom Fest on August 10th. You can link up to get tickets right online to the Austin Freedom Fest. That's a show featuring Willie Nelson, Paula Nelson, Asleep at the Wheel, Carolyn Wonderland, Megan Tubb, and others. It's taking place again on August 10th in beautiful Austin, Texas at a huge outdoor venue called The Backyard. Tickets are available online. We've got links to it at NORMLAudiostash.com. Friday, we'll hear from Mark Stepnoski. Next week, we're going to speak with Carolyn Wonderland and Ray from Asleep at the Wheel. We're going to have lots of music from all of the artists who will be performing at the show. Make sure you go live, though. Again, those tickets are available online. You can link up at NORMLAudiostash.com. On the program today, we're going to be exploring cannabis science and also reefer madness. A lot of you have probably seen the story out there originating from the UK and the Lancet, the totally false claim that marijuana can increase your risk for mental illness. We've got a breakdown and analysis of that media coverage today. We're going to speak with Dr. Mitch Earlywine in our regular Wednesday segment to really put that story in perspective. Also, we'll speak with Paul Armentano about the wider politics of this recent UK reefer madness, and we'll also speak with Maya Salovitz from George Mason University's Stats Online. They analyze statistics in the news, and she wrote a great analysis of the media coverage of that Lancet report. All that's here today on your first source for real marijuana information, NORML's Daily Audio Stash. But first, we've got news from NORML about raids taking place in California last week and this week on medical marijuana dispensaries. That news right now. Our news today. Berkeley Patients Group targeted by the DEA. The U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency seized the assets of the Berkeley Patients Group yesterday. A dispensary operated by the same group in Los Angeles, the California Patients Group, was one of more than a dozen offices raided by the DEA last week. Law enforcement seized patients' medicine and detained several employees in the Los Angeles raids, but did not make any arrests. The Berkeley Patients Group is one of just 3 medical marijuana dispensaries in Berkeley and serves about 3,000 state-authorized patients. A spokeswoman for the group said that they had about $10,000 to $15,000 in their bank account. She also stated that club employees offered to work without pay until the matter is resolved. Longtime medical marijuana activist Debbie Goldstein helped co-found and operate the Berkeley Patients Group. Goldstein had co-founded the Cannabis Action Network and speaks at numerous reform events around the country, including NORML conferences and the Seattle Hemp Fest. Almost 100 supporters of the Berkeley Club held a demonstration at the Berkeley City Council meeting last night, asking that the council declare Berkeley a sanctuary for medical marijuana dispensaries. Local media reported that the council agreed to hold a hearing on the issue. Joining us today to discuss further the situation at the Berkeley Patients Group is California NORML Coordinator Dale Geringer. Dale, thank you for joining us today. If you would, tell us a bit about the Berkeley Patients Group and their history.
Berkeley Patients Group is one of the oldest and best respected medical cannabis groups in the Bay Area. It was originally founded by some members of the Cannabis Action Network. If people are familiar with CAN, which has been doing regular marijuana activism for some years and got interested in the medical cannabis thing, started this club, which has really been on the forefront of lobbying for responsible access to medical marijuana. Berkeley Patients Group had led local efforts to regulate medical marijuana in the city of Berkeley, and then they established two sister satellite facilities down in Los Angeles, the Los Angeles and the California Patients Groups, which started doing similar kinds of activities in Los Angeles, leading the effort there for sensible regulations and helping train other medical cannabis operators in responsible practices. And they were really sort of the forefront. They were also like the political headquarters in Los Angeles for the Americans for Safe Access. They held meetings for activists and so forth. Their Los Angeles facility got raided by the DEA and LAPD in the Los Angeles raids a couple weeks ago, which I must say were really conducted in a clumsy and heavy-handed way. I mean, LAPD and DEA narcs crashed through the glass while there were customers in the store rather than knock politely and come in. We haven't really seen this kind of cowboy stuff in most other medical cannabis raids, but this was the LAPD. And I guess the LAPD really has to be blamed for what's going on here, because they are the people who moved on to seize the assets, or freeze the assets, I should say, of the Berkeley Patients Group earlier this week, operating on the theory that since all these three clubs had related management, they should all equally be subject to seizure. Let me add that the DEA says it has nothing to do with the action against Berkeley. It was really the LAPD doing it, and Berkeley is 400 miles from Los Angeles, and LAPD has no business up here, and they have a terrible reputation throughout the state for heavy-handed tactics. And it's an example of LAPD running amok. But the fear is that they might try to turn the Berkeley Patients Group's assets over to the DEA for federal forfeiture. Under state law, there would be no argument at all, because these they were operating very lawfully. They were paying taxes and complying with all local regulations. In fact, the group was about to pay, I believe today, I think $96,000 in sales taxes that were due, that they're not going to be able to pay because the LAPD has frozen the money. Just another example of the counterproductive effect of these raids.
And what has been the Berkeley city government's reaction to the LAPD coming in and taking all this action there?
They don't like it. There were 4 city council members came by yesterday at the rally, which was in front of City Hall, to denounce the raids. I expect we will see a special session of the Berkeley City Council to issue a formal pronouncement against it.
And the Berkeley Patients Group and their sister organizations, they offered a variety of services, not just cannabis dispensation, but yoga programs, therapeutic massage, nutrition programs, really a broad array of caregiving services.
That's true. They provided other caregiver services, again being a model of what a medical cannabis dispensary that cares for patients is supposed to be. It's, as usual, a very inept target by law enforcement. If they're trying to, there's been a lot of noise made by the DEA about, sleazy operators and profiteers and so forth, but that does not apply to this group whatsoever. And if they're going to try to make an example of them, they've chosen the wrong people. It's like their previous actions against WHAM and the Los Angeles Cannabis Resource Center and the Oakland Patients Group, Oakland Buyers Club, Jeff Jones some years ago. We had hoped that they wouldn't repeat that kind of heavy-handed and reactionary activity, but as I say, you can never count on the LAPD to do the right thing.
That was Dale Geringer, NORML's coordinator in California. You can link up to California NORML online at canorml.org. We have links to more information about this story and to the Berkeley Patients Group website on our own today at normalaudiostash.com.
You're listening to NORML's Daily Audio Stash.
Next up today, it's time for our weekly Cannabis Science segment with Dr. Mitch Earlywine. He's joining us today to kick off not just his regular segment, but an entire program today on cannabis science. Mitch is professor of psychology at State University of New York, author of Understanding Marijuana, A New Look at the Scientific Evidence, and editor of the new book, Pot Politics. We have links to the books at normalaudiostash.com, and Mitch is also writing a new column in High Times magazine each month. Mitch, welcome back to the program today.
Great being on.
Great to speak with you this week, Mitch. You're going to help us begin to explore this new reefer madness coming out of the UK lately. Many of our listeners will have read or seen a story in mainstream media that reported on a Lancet Journal article that seemed to suggest an increased risk for mental illness in those who smoke cannabis. But in some of our past segments right here, Mitch, we've really debunked this association by looking at the hard science on the topic. But this Lancet report, it was concerned with a meta-analysis. First, tell us what a meta-analysis is.
The bottom line for a meta-analysis is it's a review of previously done work that attempts to take the size of the effect in each individual study and put them together to get an even better estimate of what is the effect that they're getting a feel for. Back in Walter Mondale's day, I once heard him give a speech where he said, look, I've got 2 studies that say yes and 2 studies that say no. I don't know what to decide. In fact, when you go in and find out that often the studies that say no have really small effects, or the sample was really small, or maybe they weren't well done, then you can combine them in a meta-analysis and find out what's a better way of feeling like what's going on. In this one, they ended up with only 7 studies that really seemed to qualify for good longitudinal research on cannabis and psychosis, and there was a big range of effects. Some were significant, some were not, and when you boiled it all down, you did get to this odds ratio of 1.4, a 40% increase associated with heavy cannabis use early in life. In truth, most epidemiologists wouldn't make much of anything that's not a doubling of risk, but because this is marijuana, of course, we've got headlines worldwide now.
In the end, though, all of these headlines and stories are really politically charged and not really rooted in science itself. It's really about the new conservative government of Gordon Brown in the UK seeking to recriminalize cannabis there.
Yeah, Gordon Brown's in the Labour Party there, and he is definitely anti-cannabis. I feel like The study itself was expertly done and did not let a lot of politics sneak into the interpretations. But there was a comment in the Lancet that was just flagrantly irresponsible. These back-of-the-cocktail napkin calculations about, oh, well, gee, 40% of the UK smokes pot, so we're going to have 800 new cases of marijuana, induce psychosis, and it really just went off the deep end as far as the logic was concerned. And clearly that was not an unbiased assessment of the potential impact, even if this meta-analytic estimate of the effect is correct.
Now, the headlines for this Lancet report, mainstream media said things like, quote, 40% increase for psychosis among cannabis smokers, close quote, and the like. But the 40% increase that was cited in the Lancet study, that was a 40% increase over current levels, which are something like 2%, and not as if you took 100 cannabis smokers and 40 of them would then have a mental illness.
Exactly, and some of the absurdity of this comes from the fact that 6 of the 7 studies actually looked at psychosis really broadly defined and didn't require any impairment. Unfortunately, when people hear psychosis, they think, oh, schizophrenia, oh my God, this is awful. But only one of those studies actually looked at schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is not a common disorder at all, and recent estimates suggest about 5 in 1,000 people in the U.S. have schizophrenia. So a 40% increase would be something like, 7 out of 1,000. It's not enough to throw 750,000 people into an arrest for.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong here, Mitch, but the rates of marijuana smoking have steadily risen over time. I mean, that's the amount of current cannabis consumers and those who have ever tried it. Even the U.S. government admits 6,000 people per day try marijuana for the first time.
As it turns out, there were some peaks in the 1970s, and then, things have kind of ebbed and flowed since then. But also, it's different in different countries and in different eras. How come there aren't all these new schizophrenic or new psychotic people after the big peak in the 70s? Well, gee, I don't know. How come in, Sweden and Japan, where hardly anybody smokes pot, there aren't fewer schizophrenics than here in the United States or in Canada? Gee, I don't know. Maybe this is really just some correlate of something linked to psychosis, or folks who are noticing early symptoms happening to chance upon cannabis and decide to use it because it's got some effect that's different for them.
Mitch, you also made a very interesting analogy when we were exchanging emails this week on the topic, that we don't have alcohol prohibition in place just to protect pregnant women and their unborn children from the dangers of alcohol consumption, and we shouldn't be justifying any form of cannabis prohibition just to protect a very small percentage of the population who live with a serious mental illness from cannabis.
If 5 in 1,000 people happen to develop, any kind of disorder, and it was even absolutely causally linked to marijuana, you can think of literally dozens of things that are also bad for a small subset of people, and you say, hey, don't do this. Pick up a can of a diet soda, and on the side it'll say phenylketonuria. This contains phenylalanine. That means if they drink that, they'll end up retarded. But they're so small in number that we go ahead and say, hey, everybody ought to be able to have diet soda, and people who need to watch out for it should. If you've got a schizophrenic identical twin, if you've got voices that you hear every night before you use cannabis, don't use cannabis. But don't throw everybody else in jail in order to keep those people from having access.
Righto, Mitch. Well, this has been a great conversation here today. I really appreciate you joining us each week right here on the Audio Stash.
Wishing you all the best, Chris.
Thank you again, Mitch. Dr. Mitch Earlywine is professor of psychology at State University of New York, author of Understanding Marijuana, A New Look at the Scientific Evidence, and editor of the new book Pot Politics. He's writing a new column in High Times magazine each month, and we have links to his books at normalaudiostash.com. Mitch joins us right here on the Audio Stash every Wednesday for his Cannabis Science segment. Stay tuned today for further analysis of the media's reefer madness on this Lancet report with Maya Slavitz from George Mason University and Paul Armentano, NORML Senior Policy Analyst. That's coming up next. Joining us next today is Maya Slavitz, who writes for Stats at George Mason University. They're checking out the facts and figures behind the news. Her most recent article explored the media reports surrounding the Lancet Journal meta-analysis publication. Maya, welcome here to NORML's Daily Audio Stash today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you again for joining us today, Maya. I was really impressed with the analysis you offered of the media's coverage. First, let me ask you about your first impressions of the media coverage of this marijuana and mental illness report.
I was just amazed that they could sort of take at face value the idea that smoking one joint would give you a 40% increase in risk in becoming psychotic. Because most of these reporters have smoked pot themselves, and if they haven't, they've seen their friends do it. 50% of the population, has done it basically. So, if this were true, we should be seeing these massive outbreaks of psychosis, which we're just not seeing. So I wondered why they were I didn't wonder because I've seen this before, unfortunately, but I was amazed at how they swallowed it.
Do you think there is a general misunderstanding when it comes to scientific data and statistics among members of the media, or that editors and reporters are just going for the attention-getting headlines?
I think both are true. Sometimes there's just the sheer sensationalism, and of course, the headlines are usually written by people who don't actually write the story, so sometimes there's a sensationalistic headline on a very good story. I've, in fact, had that happen to me. So you've got that, but I think there is also a very widespread mathematical and statistical illiteracy.
Also, you note in the article that to epidemiologists, a 40% increase is not especially noteworthy. Why does an increased risk factor have to be something like 200 or 300% or more, which seems like a lot, but why does it need to be in that range for it to be significant to scientists?
It's basically mathematically complicated, but the bottom line is that in epidemiological studies, the factors probably aren't causal in the first place. And so you have to have it has to be a stronger connection for it to matter. Now, this is different than in a controlled trial where you know that the two different groups are randomized. But in a uncontrolled trial, which this essentially is, people are self-selecting to what they do. You're not randomly giving marijuana to people.
Right.
And so you need much larger numbers and much bigger factors for them to make a real difference and to get through the sort of noise of the confounding data.
And how about the method itself here, the meta-analysis? Is that worth reporting on when the standalone studies were already out there?
Every one of these studies were reported with similarly hysterical headlines. I do think meta-analysis can often be very valuable, but it's very complicated. It's hard to do well, and you need to – sometimes what people are doing is picking up on things that are from very different studies that really aren't comparable, and so it's very hard to control for that adequately, and it gets very complicated really fast, and it's really hard for people to know, what it means. On the other hand, when you have a large body of data and a good meta-analysis can help you sum up a body of research in a very, very useful way, and people like the Cochrane Reviews do a wonderful job do really strict reviews of things and come up with very important findings. So I wouldn't just throw away the idea of meta-analysis.
And also, Maya, when it comes to marijuana, we've seen politics and science either twisted or even pitted against each other in many ways in these decades of prohibition. Do you see that relationship of science and politics having changed a bit, even in the last few years?
It seems to be, and it's interesting because the British are usually way more sensible, but on this issue they seem to be very interested in starting a moral panic about marijuana. And it's, there's a small group of scientists over there who have become convinced that marijuana produces schizophrenia, and they keep coming out with this stuff, and they keep trying to get media attention and successfully getting media attention. And there's a political movement over there to basically recriminalize marijuana. They downgraded the classification under Blair, Brown may be trying to distinguish himself in some way. The ACMD, which is the Advisory Committee on the Misuse of Drugs, looked at all of these studies and concluded that this was not causal, and that this is probably an artifact of the fact that people with predispositions to psychosis tend to smoke marijuana, and in certain instances, marijuana can make it worse. They also didn't believe that changing the legal status was going to have any impact on people with predispositions for psychosis.
Righto. And when it comes to schizophrenia specifically, we haven't seen any increase in the number of people with schizophrenia in decades.
Well, and probably generations. And the amazing thing to me about the coverage was simply that, if you have this supposedly huge risk factor, when we had this genuinely huge risk factor with lung cancer and cigarette smoking, you could follow an increase in cigarette smoking, and 20 years later, there you would see the increase in lung cancer, and decline, you would see a decline. If it's a major risk factor, you should be seeing real-world effects, and yet we aren't.
And finally today, Maya, I'd like to explore the use of statistics in the media in general here. From science to health to politics, everyone in the media loves to use statistics and numbers. Is it somewhat disingenuous to use all these numbers on the public because the formulas to get to those final percentages or numbers can be so complex?
I actually think that a lot of it is really simple. I am not personally a mathematician, and there's stuff that rapidly gets too complex for me, but I have a basic education in statistics and probably a little bit more than that, obviously. But a lot of it is pure logic. A lot of it is simply being able to say, wait a minute, does this make sense? And knowing a few very basic things about statistics can allow you to be an intelligent consumer of media. You don't have to be any kind of genius or anything like that. In fact, we have a risk guide on the Stats website, which is a guide to understanding some of this stuff, and it really, really isn't that hard. Unfortunately, people just haven't been educated in it, and I think that if we could educate both the public and the media better, statistics are incredibly valuable. The scientific method is the best way that we have for understanding the world. We need to be able to understand it, purely even on a logical level. And then, we obviously need experts to go up a level above that, but if you just get to the logical level, you can debunk 90% of the crap.
And do you think the public may have, more questions about statistics than understanding of the numbers, the way they're presented by the media?
Well, the media oversimplifies, and it's always going to do that to some extent. But if you just read stories and view stories with the idea to, is this causal? I mean, I could spend 90% of my time just debunking things that confuse correlation and cause. Understanding how you distinguish between those things, and the ideas of things like randomization and control groups, once you understand sort of how it works and what the possible confounding things are, then it's relatively easy to say, okay, well, this probably means something and this probably doesn't. And, also one study, now, of course, this was a meta-analysis, so that should have more weight often, but one study generally doesn't mean anything till you have a large body of literature. It's really hard to know what's going on. And when you have a large body of literature, for example, nobody debates smoking causes lung cancer anymore. And of course, interestingly, people would say, oh, that was only correlational at first, but the magnitude of the correlation, is a factor of 10 and 20 and 50, as opposed, smoking and lung cancer, it magnifies it 1,000%, 10,000%. You're not talking 40%. Well, and what's interesting, too, is there just appeared a report today claiming that one joint was equal to 5 chain-smoked cigarettes. And it didn't note, of course, that the case control studies which have been done, which are now looking very closely, desperately trying to find marijuana causing lung cancer, are not finding it. And again, it's that same skewed kind of coverage. Now, some of this also results from simple laziness where people get a press release, they call the one guy, they write it up instead of, calling other people to find alternate opinions and find out and put it in context. So you get that as well.
And do you think that science and health reporting has more of a bias today or some sort of an agenda? I mean, when you talk about the press releases being pulled and the like.
Well, I mean, not always. A lot of it, if by agenda you mean that the researcher wants to get more funding, then yes. But, I don't think that, the fact of putting out a press release necessarily means there's a bad agenda or a worrisome agenda. But I do think, science, obviously the pharmaceutical industry has big money in science, and the NIH, there's obviously money interest there to some extent. But I don't think, I think there's separate problems. In one sense, science is covered a bit too much like politics, in which they play sort of A versus B. The global warming debate would be the classic example of that, where, they said they played it as though the climate skeptics had as much weight as the people who believed that humans were helping change the climate, even though there was like 2% of scientists who were skeptic and 98%, and that when you do balance that way, it's not representative. So in that sense, you get coverage that's sort of too much like politics, and then in the other time you get it that's not enough, where you just sort of accept a press release and don't look for other points of view.
Well, Maya, this has been a wonderful conversation here today. I really appreciate you taking time to speak with us.
Sure, thank you so much.
Thank you again. Maya Slavitz is a writer for Stats at George Mason University. They check out the facts and figures behind the news. We have links to their website and their risk assessment guide, as well as Maya's recent article on the Lancet Journal coverage, right up on our website today at normalaudiostash.com. Stay tuned. Paul Armentano, NORML's senior policy analyst, joins us to weigh in on this topic today, coming up next.
You're listening to NORML's Daily Audio Stash.
Paul Armentano is NORML's senior policy analyst. His commentaries and columns appear in numerous publications around the world on almost a daily basis. Paul, welcome back here to the program today.
Good to be here, Chris.
Always good to have you here on the program, Paul. So this story originates with an article in the British medical journal, The Lancet. And it wasn't really the study itself that went wrong here. It was the media's coverage of it, especially when it comes to the British press coverage of the topic in general of marijuana and mental illness. This is sort of an ongoing thing in the UK right now. So, tell us a bit how this coverage has evolved there.
It's really interesting for readers or listeners who may not know. The United Kingdom, it essentially decriminalized the simple possession of marijuana in 2004, and that was done by declassifying marijuana from a Schedule B drug in Britain to a Schedule C drug. Schedule C drugs are considered to be soft drugs in Great Britain, and possession of those drugs does not warrant an automatic criminal arrest. Police have the discretion to arrest users, but in general, as a matter of practice, they simply give a warning or a citation. Now, prior to 2004, there was a multi-year campaign from the Blair government to downgrade marijuana so that its possession and use would no longer be an arrestable offense. And during those years, the media, ironically, was very friendly to the issue. The Independent on Sunday, many of the major papers in Great Britain were lobbying the Blair government for this downgrade. And then when it took place in January of 2004, it was like somebody flipped a light switch. And almost from that day forward, the media has just run with sensational headlines talking about the alleged dangers of cannabis, particularly this notion that smoking marijuana will make you crazy. It really, in some ways, doesn't make any sense. Here you had the media calling for this downgrade, and then when they finally got it, they almost began backpedaling the next day.
And, Paul, what has been the real-world impact of that downgrade of cannabis in Britain?
Well, because, data is always a few years behind, we really only have 1 or maybe 2 years at the most of data to look at, but the number of arrests for simple marijuana possession, not surprisingly, have dropped in some places significantly in Great Britain. And what's probably most important to point out is that use of marijuana among young people in Great Britain has also dropped since reclassification. Now, that goes against many of the arguments that several conservative politicians are using in Britain, claiming that, in fact, since reclassifications, teens think marijuana is now legal and they're using marijuana in greater numbers. The actual data does not bear that out, and it shows the opposite is actually true.
And where has this political push for recriminalization come from in the UK? I know Tony Blair's Home Secretary, David Blunkett, supported the classification downgrade in 2004, but what about now with the new conservative regime in Britain and Gordon Brown's government?
This government, almost from the day they took office, has made it clear that they intend to reclassify marijuana and once again make it a Class B drug. They've also made it clear that they want to overhaul the entire scheduling of drugs in Great Britain. And what's interesting is that The Lancet, of all journals, in March of this year, actually published a very comprehensive paper that was attempting to set some sort of rational and objective criteria so that if the administration actually did go ahead and look at the larger question of reclassifying not just marijuana but any number of drugs, where should they be classified so that the scheduling was in line with their actual harms to society and to the user. And just this past March, The Lancet, when they did this report, they said that clearly alcohol and tobacco are more harmful to the user than marijuana. And in fact, if we were to schedule drugs appropriate to their harms, tobacco and alcohol would be scheduled in a more restrictive class than cannabis. I find it ironic that literally just months before this recent panic, you had The Lancet making that very astute observation and not talking about any potential risks of marijuana and psychosis at all in that paper, which, as I said, was only published a matter of months ago.
Now, Paul, when we talk about classifying cannabis in the UK, how does that process work there?
Well, there is a branch or I would say a nonpartisan advisory committee in Great Britain known as the Advisory Committee on the Misuse of Drugs. I guess if there's going to be a U.S. equivalent, you might compare that to the National Academy of Sciences Institute of Medicine. Now, the ACMD has to sign off on any reclassification of a drug. So when marijuana was downgraded in 2004, the ACMD in late 2003, they looked at all the data that was out there concerning marijuana use and its potential harms, and they confirmed that, in fact, marijuana was inappropriately classified as Schedule B and it should be moved to as a Class C drug. They actually revisited this issue only a couple years later, and in January of 2006, the ACMD came out again, and they reaffirmed their position. They said we should not go back and we should not reclassify marijuana as a Schedule B drug. We think it's properly classified now as a Schedule C drug. And specifically, they answered claims that marijuana use might be linked to psychotic behavior, schizophrenia, and mental illness. And at that time, they reviewed all the same data that was recently published in The Lancet, but the ACMD at that time, and keep in mind this was simply January 2006, less than 2 years ago, they said if there was any causal connection between marijuana use and mental illness, that the association was weak at best. They basically saw nothing to these claims. And unfortunately, if the ACMD turns around in another 6 months or in a year and reverses that stance, I think it'll be obvious to everyone watching that it was simply a political decision and it wasn't based in science or fact.
And when the ACMD looked at cannabis classification, they had all of the data and the science that was included in this Lancet published meta-analysis available to them. Is that right?
Sure, of course. This meta-analysis, keep in mind it was published in the Lancet, just this month, but it was accepted for approval months earlier, and the authors began writing this, sometime earlier. So naturally, the studies they were looking at, have been available in the public domain in most cases for years, in some cases for decades. So yes, they were looking at the same material that the ACMD looked at in 2004 and then once again in 2006. And like I said, they found any causal connection at best to be weak.
And did the U.S. ever really acknowledge that reclassification and decriminalization of cannabis by the U.K.?
I don't know if they ever acknowledged it. The United Nations comes out with a report every year, and I remember the United Nations talking about it and naturally criticizing it because they take a very prohibitionist bent. But I cannot recall the drug czar or any high-ranking anti-drug officials in this country acknowledging either prior to reclassification or during or after reclassification, ever talking about this change taking place in the UK. In fact, I really believe they ignored it. And I would imagine that was a strategic decision for them to do so. I don't see a whole lot of crossover. David Blunkett, the former Home Secretary for Tony Blair, he began talking about the need to reclassify marijuana, I believe, as far back as 2000, maybe 2001. But the fact was this was a multi-year campaign over there, and I don't recall the U.S. government getting involved, either pro or con whatsoever. And as I said, I certainly don't recall them after reclassification talking about it either.
Oh, very interesting, Paul. So, in the end here, this Lancet report coverage, this is science and politics mixing like oil and water again, but it's also some indication into the media politics on the issue of marijuana as well.
It's clear, and Maya talked about this, very articulately. A lot of these writers, for better or worse, they're simply lazy. Oftentimes they'll just glance at the press release that the journal put out. They won't look at the actual study. Many times the study's embargoed. Some of these writers, believe it or not, are writing about studies they haven't even read because the study isn't public yet when they're writing the story. My biggest concern when I read stories like this is the lack of institutional memory. Each writer will write this report as if they're in some sort of bubble, and no one's ever written about this issue beforehand, and there's no data before the particular study they're writing about to draw upon. As Maya talked about, the most damning retort to this theory that smoking marijuana will, increase your chances of becoming psychotic by 40% is the fact that all around the world and across cultures, there has been explosions in marijuana use over the past few generations, and they have not been accompanied by a similar explosion in mental illness. Anyone who's looking at this study or looking at the press release from the Lancet and writing this story, in their back of their mind, that fact has got to jump out at them. Yet they wrote the story as if there is no real-world experience with cannabis with which to draw from. Same thing with this new report that just came out today claiming that somehow smoking one marijuana cigarette is damaging as smoking 5 tobacco cigarettes. No mention of the fact that it was only months ago these same media markets were reporting on the largest case-controlled study ever performed looking at marijuana use and cancer links that found no association between even long-term use of marijuana and cancers of the lung or cancers of the upper respiratory tracts. Amazing. The Washington Post had an A3 story on this study today, and they had a major front page story just several months ago basically contradicting this paper, but they made no mention to the prior study in their current report, and that happens all the time.
Well, Paul, this has been a great discussion here today on this topic. I really appreciate you taking time to weigh in on all of this.
No problem, Chris. Good to talk to you.
Thank you again, Paul. Paul Armentano is NORML's senior policy analyst. You can find his writings online. He's author of the report, Emerging Clinical Applications for Cannabis and Cannabinoids. You can read that online. We have links to it at normalaudio-stash.com. to NORML's Daily Audio Stash, the growing truth about cannabis. Make sure you visit our website at normalaudiostash.com. That's NORMLAUDIOSTASH.com for more information about every day's show. I'm your host, Chris Goldstein. Thanks for listening today. See you at 4:20 tomorrow.